The story of German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service is a complex, multi-layered, and often misunderstood chapter of 20th century history, one that illuminates the intricate intersections between gender, ideology, militarism, and everyday participation in a totalitarian system. Far from being a marginal footnote, the involvement of women in the Wehrmacht reveals much about how the Nazi Germany mobilized its population for total war, how traditional gender roles were both reinforced and strategically bent under the pressures of conflict, and how ordinary individuals, young, ambitious, frightened, disciplined, or ideologically conditioned, became woven into the fabric of a regime built on aggression, domination, and systematic violence. The evolution of women's roles within the Wehrmacht reflects the contradictions inherent in the Nazi worldview, a regime that championed female domesticity, yet relied heavily on women to sustain the administrative, communicative, and logistical infrastructure of its vast military machine. These women did not serve as frontline combatants, yet their labor, commitment, and proximity to military decision-making made them indispensable to the functioning of the German war apparatus. Their presence reveals the extent to which modern warfare depends not only on soldiers, but on a deep network of support personnel whose work, typing orders, decoding messages, plotting anti-aircraft trajectories, maintaining files, or organizing transport, ensures that the machinery of war moves with deadly precision. Understanding the role of German female auxiliaries requires engaging with a spectrum of experiences that ranged from patriotic enthusiasm to pragmatic participation, from ideological fervor to coerced compliance, and from genuine ignorance to uneasy awareness of the atrocities unfolding around them. The emergence of these auxiliary units occurred gradually, shaped by wartime necessity and the expanding bureaucratic demands of a military engaged in continental conquest. In the early years, the Nazi leadership insisted that women remain tied to domestic and reproductive roles, viewing their primary function as supporting the Volk through motherhood and service in community organizations. Yet as the war intensified and manpower shortages grew, the Wehrmacht increasingly relied on women to fill critical vacancies in communication networks, intelligence processing centers, air defense operations, and administrative headquarters. What began as voluntary recruitment soon transformed into a structured, standardized, and disciplined system that drew tens of thousands of women into uniformed military service, albeit officially categorized as auxiliaries rather than soldiers. Their training combined technical instruction with militarized discipline and ideological education, ensuring not only competence but loyalty, discretion, and adherence to protocol. For many young women, this represented a rare opportunity for mobility, purpose, and independence within a society that otherwise restricted their roles. For others, it was an obligation shaped by social pressure, labor policies, or economic necessity. The diversity of their motivations underscores the reality that participation in wartime systems is rarely monolithic. It is shaped by personal aspirations, national narratives, and the constraints imposed by an authoritarian state. Yet the significance of their service extends beyond training and duty descriptions. Women positioned in communications hubs, command posts, and intelligence units were embedded within the operational heart of the Wehrmacht, a military force responsible for mass destruction, occupation, and war crimes across Europe. Although auxiliaries did not carry weapons or issue orders, they handled information, transmitted directives, and maintained the bureaucratic order that enabled military campaigns, anti-partisan operations, deportations, and systematic violence. Their roles complicate simplistic distinctions between combatants and civilians, challenging us to consider how modern systems of oppression rely on networks of support that extend far beyond immediate perpetrators. The moral and ethical dimensions of their service remain deeply contested. To what extent were female auxiliaries aware of the regime's atrocities? How much responsibility rests with individuals who performed administrative or technical tasks within a criminal system? These questions do not yield easy answers, especially as personal testimonies, post-war narratives, and historical evidence often reveal discrepancies between memory, knowledge, and accountability. Many women insisted they were unaware of the full scope of Nazi crimes, particularly those stationed in rear offices far from the front, while others admitted that rumors, glimpses, or fragments of information created an undercurrent of discomfort they never fully confronted. Regardless of personal awareness, the collective impact of their labor contributed to sustaining the efficiency of a military apparatus engaged in catastrophic violence. The final collapse of the Third Reich brought with it a dramatic shift in the fate of these women. As Allied forces advanced, auxiliary units disintegrated, fled, or were abandoned in the chaos of retreat. Many sought safety in the West, fearing Soviet retribution, while others were swept into captivity in the East, where long marches, brutal interrogations, or forced labor awaited them. In the West, women faced detention, questioning, and denazification procedures, though most were eventually released and reintegrated into society, often carrying memories of fear, loss, and displacement. In the East, the consequences were harsher, shaped by the immense suffering inflicted by the German invasion. These divergent post-war experiences became foundational to the ways women later remembered and narrated their wartime service. Some constructed narratives that emphasized duty, youthfulness, or ignorance. Others maintained silence for decades, shaped by shame, trauma, or fear of judgment. As post-war Germany rebuilt itself, the presence of former auxiliaries in everyday life became an unspoken reality, folded into larger national narratives that alternated between selective forgetting and cautious confrontation with the past. Over time, the representation of female auxiliaries in public memory, scholarship, and cultural media underwent significant transformation. Early portrayals largely absolved them of responsibility, casting them as naive girls caught in the currents of war. But as historical research advanced, particularly with the rise of women's history, memory studies, and critical examinations of the Wehrmacht's role in war crimes, this narrative shifted. Scholars began to analyze the gendered dimensions of participation in authoritarian regimes, the interplay between agency and coercion, and the ways in which administrative labor supports systems of violence. This led to a more nuanced understanding of auxiliaries, not as unwilling pawns, but as individuals whose motivations, actions, and contexts deserve careful, critical examination. Cultural depictions evolved as well. Films, novels, and documentaries began to portray these women with greater complexity, acknowledging their ambitions, fears, blind spots, and complicity. Oral history projects recorded testimonies that revealed the emotional weight of their experiences, the strategies of self-justification or silence, and the moral ambiguities they continued to wrestle with decades after the war. The origins of female participation in the Wehrmacht trace back to the structural, ideological, and logistical challenges that Germany faced in the early 1930s, long before the formal involvement of women became an operational necessity. As the Nazi regime solidified its authority, its ideological stance on gender roles was deeply rooted in the doctrine of Kinder, Küche, Kirch, emphasizing women's duties as mothers, caretakers, and custodians of the racial future. Despite this rigid framework, the reality of preparing Germany for a total war economy began to reveal contradictions. With rapid rearmament, extensive conscription, and an economy shifting toward military output, gaps in clerical, administrative, and communication sectors emerged. These positions, though essential, did not align with the regime's glorification of male military service, creating an ideological dilemma. The Nazi leadership initially sought to limit women's contact with the armed forces, avoiding any impression that the Wehrmacht relied on female labor. Yet, as Germany's ambitions expanded, necessity began shaping policy more than ideological purity, marking the first cracks through which female auxiliaries would eventually enter military structures. During the early years of rearmament, women began appearing indirectly in military-adjacent organizations, rather than within the Wehrmacht proper. Groups such as the Reichsarbeitsdienst für die weibliche Jugend and the National Socialist Women's League, NS-Frauenschaft, mobilized women for labor, training, and community service, cultivating a disciplined pool of female workers loyal to the state. Though their roles centered on agricultural, domestic, and social duties, these organizations fostered administrative skills that would later become transferable to auxiliary military positions. The regime did not initially conceive these institutions as stepping stones to military service, but the structural overlap became increasingly apparent as Germany prepared for conflict. By the mid-1930s, the logistical burden of maintaining a massive standing army pressured policymakers to reconsider earlier prohibitions. Female workers were soon sought for roles in military hospitals, telecommunication centers, and supply offices, areas requiring precision, stability, and large numbers of trained personnel. The outbreak of war in 1939 accelerated this shift dramatically. The rapid mobilization of millions of men created a vacuum in sectors that had previously depended on male labor. Administrative staff, switchboard operators, typists, and other clerical workers were suddenly in short supply. The Wehrmacht faced an administrative overload that threatened operational efficiency at home and on the front. Women became the logical solution, not out of ideological transformation, but out of urgent necessity. Initially labeled as civilian employees, these women performed essential tasks deeply integrated into military command networks. Their presence exposed the practical limitations of Nazi gender ideology, forcing military leaders to adapt policy to wartime realities. Over time, civilian status became insufficient to define their growing involvement, and the push for a more formalized structure emerged. By 1940, female auxiliaries were increasingly visible in the Wehrmacht's communication units, intelligence offices, transport logistics departments, and meteorological services. Even as their duties expanded, the regime carefully controlled public perception to avoid suggesting that women were part of combat operations. Direct involvement in battle remained ideologically unacceptable, but supporting the apparatus that sustained combat was unavoidable. Their deployment also reflected a broader European trend. As war escalated into a total conflict, every nation relied heavily on women to fill essential support roles. The German case, however, remained distinctly shaped by ideological caution and contradictory messaging. Women were praised as indispensable supporters, yet denied full recognition as military personnel, illustrating the tension between propaganda and practical necessity. Recruiting women into auxiliary roles coincided with emerging debates within the Nazi hierarchy about the future of female participation. Hardline ideologues resisted any expansion of women's roles, arguing that Germany's strength depended on maintaining traditional gender boundaries. Military pragmatists, however, insisted that the wartime situation demanded flexibility. The Wehrmacht High Command recognized that without female participation, critical communication and administrative networks would collapse under the strain of long-term conflict. These debates often played out behind closed doors, but their consequences shaped the structure of female participation throughout the war. Ultimately, the military perspective prevailed, not out of ideological victory, but because the realities of total war left no alternative. As the war extended into Eastern Europe, the need for female labor increased further. The sprawling network of field headquarters, intelligence stations, and supply depots required workers capable of managing enormous information flows. Women became essential in encoding and decoding messages, compiling logistical reports, maintaining personnel records, and operating communication lines across vast distances. Their precise work contributed to the functioning of the military machine, even though they remained excluded from full soldier status. The regime carefully avoided calling them soldiers, instead categorizing them as Hilfswillen or Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, emphasizing their assisting nature. Yet the distinction was largely bureaucratic. In practice, they lived, worked, and sometimes faced the same dangers as frontline support units. By 1942, the role of women in the Wehrmacht had become so widespread that standardized classifications emerged across branches of the armed forces. The Luftwaffe employed women in anti-aircraft command posts, radar stations, and weather services. The Navy used female auxiliaries in coastal communication and administrative offices, and the Army relied on them for an expanding array of office and technical duties. This structured incorporation signaled a pivotal moment. The auxiliary service was no longer a temporary wartime improvisation, but a recognized component of the military support system. While Nazi ideology insisted on preserving symbolic distinctions between men and women, their expanding scale of duties placed women closer to military authority and infrastructure than ever before. The institutionalization of female participation also brought changes to how women were trained and selected for military duties. Specialized training programs developed around communication technology, cryptography, administrative management, and technical operations. These programs, though segregated by gender, mirrored the rigor of military instruction for male personnel. Women were expected to maintain discipline, adhere to strict codes of conduct, and perform duties with precision. This shift signaled that the Wehrmacht increasingly relied on skilled female labor rather than untrained civilian volunteers. As their competencies grew, so did their integration into military planning and operational execution. Despite their expanding contributions, female auxiliaries remained overshadowed by ideological constraints. Nazi propaganda rarely glorified their work, focusing instead on the heroism of male soldiers. When women did appear in wartime media, they were portrayed as supportive figures rather than essential members of the military network. This narrative shaped both public perception and the women's own experiences, creating a dissonance between their actual importance and the limited recognition they received. Their contributions, though indispensable, were framed within the ideological boundaries of femininity and duty rather than professional competence. The origins of female participation in the Wehrmacht thus reveal a complex interplay between ideology, necessity, and evolving wartime demands. What began as limited involvement in civilian capacities grew into a vast network of auxiliary labor that sustained Germany's military infrastructure. The transformation reflected not an ideological shift, but a reluctant accommodation driven by the pressures of total war. Women stepped into roles originally deemed unsuitable for them, challenging the regime's rigid gender norms through their indispensable contributions. Their presence exposed the contradictions of Nazi ideology while simultaneously highlighting the adaptability of military structures under extreme circumstances. These origins also laid the foundation for the more formalized Wehrmacht auxiliary service that would emerge in later years. As women became critical to communication, logistics, and administrative systems, their integration became both systematic and necessary. The narrative of their early participation sets the stage for understanding how their roles expanded, diversified, and ultimately placed them in positions that blurred the boundaries between civilian and military identity. Their journey into the Wehrmacht was neither simple nor ideologically consistent, but it was essential to the functioning of Germany's war machine and remains a critical part of understanding the broader dynamics of gender, labor, and power in the Nazi state. The recruitment, training, and organizational structure of German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service emerged from a combination of wartime necessity, evolving ideological accommodations, and expanding bureaucratic demands that gradually transformed the role of women in Nazi Germany's military apparatus. While Nazi ideology initially discouraged women's involvement in military-related work, the rapid mobilization of men for frontline combat created a significant vacuum in administrative, technical, and communication sectors. This shift pushed the Wehrmacht's leadership to reconsider long-standing gender norms, leading to the establishment of structured recruitment systems and formalized training pathways designed specifically for female auxiliaries. Early recruitment efforts relied on both voluntary enlistment and targeted appeals through organizations such as the Reichsarbeitsdienst für die weibliche Jugend, or WWII, which had already shaped millions of young women into disciplined laborers committed to state service. These institutions provided an existing pool of recruits who possessed basic organizational and technical skills, easing their transition into military-adjacent roles. The process quickly expanded into a coordinated effort, with military offices issuing directives that outlined qualifications, age requirements, and the skill sets needed for various auxiliary branches. As recruitment became more formalized, the Wehrmacht introduced specialized screening procedures intended to assess candidates' aptitude, loyalty, and capacity for technical work. Prospective auxiliaries underwent medical examinations, ideological evaluations, and interviews to determine their suitability for service, paralleling the recruitment methods used for male soldiers while maintaining gender-specific distinctions. Women with experience in clerical work, telephone operation, telegraphy, radio communication, or foreign languages were highly sought after, as the Wehrmacht increasingly depended on efficient information flow across vast operational spaces. The military also prioritized individuals capable of maintaining secrecy, discipline, and emotional resilience, since many positions involved handling sensitive intelligence or supporting high-pressure communication networks. By the early 1940s, the demand for skilled personnel was so great that recruitment expanded across all regions of the Reich, supplemented by campaigns encouraging patriotic women to serve in the national war effort. Training for female auxiliaries evolved in parallel with recruitment. Initially ad hoc and inconsistent, instruction soon developed into a systematic curriculum tailored to the demands of each branch of the Wehrmacht. Women destined for communication roles attended Nachrichtenschulen, or signal schools, where they learned to operate switchboards, encrypt and decrypt messages, manage radio equipment, and maintain communication logs with military precision. The programs were intensive, with classes running from early morning until late evening, emphasizing speed, accuracy, and strict adherence to protocol. Administrative trainees were instructed in bookkeeping, personnel record keeping, document handling, and logistical planning, all essential to the functioning of headquarters and supply networks. Those assigned to meteorological or technical roles received specialized training in data collection, instrument operation, and reporting procedures. Across all areas, training incorporated military discipline, marching drills, inspections, and uniform regulations, reinforcing a sense of order and responsibility that mirrored the structure of male military training while avoiding combat-related instruction. An essential aspect of the training system was the ideological education embedded within every course. Instructors emphasized loyalty to the Führer, the importance of the war effort, and the necessity of maintaining secrecy. Propaganda lectures reinforced the belief that women were supporting Germany's destiny and fulfilling their duties as racial and national comrades. Even as they were being trained to perform highly technical tasks, the regime insisted on framing their contributions as an extension of their roles as supporters, rather than equals within the military hierarchy. This ideological framing served to maintain the illusion that women were merely assisting and not taking on responsibilities traditionally reserved for men, despite the fact that their roles were increasingly vital to military operations. The organizational structure of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Service gradually expanded into a complex system encompassing multiple branches, each with its own hierarchy, regulations, and operational protocols. The most extensive of these branches was the Army's Female Auxiliary Service, which handled communication, administration, transport coordination, and intelligence support. The Luftwaffe employed large numbers of women in anti-aircraft command posts, radar stations, airfield operations, and meteorological units, where their precision and steadiness under pressure proved invaluable. The Navy relied on female auxiliaries for coastal communications, cipher work, and administrative management in naval command centers. Each branch organized women into units led by female supervisors or, when necessary, by male officers who oversaw training, discipline, and assignments. Uniform regulations further formalized the status of female auxiliaries within the Wehrmacht. While designed to maintain visual separation between women and frontline soldiers, the uniforms nonetheless signaled their official affiliation with the military. Distinctive badges, rank-style indicators, and color-coded insignia denoted their branch and role. Despite these visible symbols, auxiliaries occupied an ambiguous position, formally subordinate, technically civilian at first, but increasingly treated as military personnel in all practical senses. Their living quarters were often located within military installations, and their daily routines followed regimented schedules aligned with the needs of the units they served. As the war intensified, the organizational structure became more centralized and bureaucratically refined. Military commands developed classification systems that divided auxiliaries into categories based on skill level, technical specialization, and operational importance. This system allowed for rapid deployment of trained personnel to areas most in need, including field headquarters near active fronts. The increasing movement of female auxiliaries toward operational zones represented a significant shift in their role and highlighted how indispensable their service had become. The Wehrmacht ultimately recognized that its communication and administrative networks could not function without the sustained labor of tens of thousands of trained women whose expertise had been shaped by rigorous instruction and disciplined organization. By 1943, the recruitment and organizational systems had expanded to such an extent that female auxiliaries formed a recognizable and essential component of the military structural framework. Their integration demonstrated that, despite ideological constraints, the demands of total war compelled the regime to harness the full capacity of its population. Female auxiliaries had evolved from temporary support workers into highly trained and coordinated personnel whose contributions underpinned the complex machinery of the German war effort. Their training, discipline, and organizational structure laid the foundation for their increasingly critical roles on both the Eastern and Western fronts, setting the stage for the next phase of their involvement in the Wehrmacht's operations. The roles and responsibilities of German women in the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Service on both the Eastern and Western fronts evolved rapidly as the war escalated and the demands on Germany's military infrastructure increased. Although Nazi ideology sought to limit women's participation to supportive, non-combat roles, the realities of total war blurred these boundaries and placed tens of thousands of women in positions that connected them directly to frontline operations. Their work was indispensable to the functioning of the Wehrmacht's command networks, logistical systems, and intelligence apparatus. As the German military expanded its territorial control, particularly after the invasions of Poland and the Soviet Union, the need for reliable, disciplined personnel to manage communications, maintain order in field headquarters, and coordinate transportation networks grew exponentially. Female auxiliaries, trained in specialized skills and bound by military discipline, became an essential component of these operations. Though they did not bear arms, their work often placed them under threat from enemy advances, artillery fire, and the instability of rapidly shifting front lines, making their service far more dangerous than traditional gender roles would suggest. On the Eastern Front, the most expansive and brutal theater of war, female auxiliaries played critical roles in sustaining the Wehrmacht's complex communication systems. The enormity of the Soviet Union required vast networks of wired telephones, radio posts, cipher stations, and message relay points, all of which relied on trained personnel capable of processing high volumes of information with precision. Women served as Funkerin, radio operators, Fernsprecherinnen, telephone operators, and Stabshelferinnen, staff assistants, ensuring that orders from divisional, corps, and army-level commands reached frontline units. Their shifts were long, often involving continuous operation during active offensives or retreats, with the pressure to maintain uninterrupted communication despite bombardments, signal disruptions, or equipment failures. Many worked in fortified bunkers, makeshift shelters, or commandeered buildings near active combat zones, where the noise of artillery and the proximity of danger were constant. The efficiency and reliability of their work directly influenced the Wehrmacht's ability to coordinate movements, reinforce units, and respond to Soviet counterattacks. Beyond communication duties, women on the Eastern Front also performed essential administrative tasks that helped sustain the vast German war machine. They compiled casualty reports, maintained personnel files, organized transport schedules, recorded the movement of supplies, and managed documentation critical to the functioning of military bureaucracy. These tasks, though seemingly mundane, were vital in a theater where millions of soldiers depended on coordinated logistical planning. In many field headquarters, women became the backbone of day-to-day operations, providing continuity and stability amid the chaos of shifting battle lines. Their meticulous record-keeping and administrative precision allowed commanders to make informed decisions, track unit readiness, and maintain an overview of rapidly changing situations. This role placed them within the inner workings of military command structures, granting them insight into strategic developments and operational outcomes. A significant portion of female auxiliaries on the Eastern Front also supported reconnaissance, mapping, and weather services. Meteorological forecasting was essential for planning troop movements, air operations, and artillery strikes. Women trained in meteorology collected atmospheric data, prepared forecasts, and transmitted vital reports to pilots, artillery units, and field commanders. In mapping units, they worked with reconnaissance photographs, updated charts, and assisted in producing terrain assessments crucial for operational planning. Their accuracy and technical proficiency had direct consequences on battlefield outcomes, particularly in regions where weather and terrain drastically influenced mobility and visibility. These specialized roles demonstrated the growing reliance on female expertise in fields previously considered too technical or sensitive for women. The Eastern Front, with its harsh climate, fluid front lines, and brutal combat, placed female auxiliaries under considerable strain. Many experienced hardships similar to those faced by soldiers: exposure to extreme cold, food shortages, long marches between postings, and the constant threat of encirclement or capture. During Soviet offensives, female auxiliaries often found themselves trapped behind advancing enemy lines, forced to flee with rear echelon units or abandoned during chaotic retreats. Some were killed during bombardments, while others fell into Soviet hands, facing violence, imprisonment, or forced labor. Despite their non-combat roles, the proximity to danger meant that survival frequently depended on rapid relocation and the protection provided by retreating Wehrmacht units. Their vulnerability highlighted the contradiction between ideological narratives of femininity and the harsh realities of their deployment. On the Western Front, the experiences of female auxiliaries differed in significant ways, but were still marked by intensive responsibility. The Western theater was technologically more sophisticated, with greater reliance on radar, anti-aircraft command systems, and advanced communication networks. Women in the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Service worked in flock command centers, tracking Allied aircraft using radar screens, processing incoming reports, and relaying firing instructions to anti-aircraft batteries. Although they did not operate the guns themselves, their calculations and data transmission directly influenced defensive operations during Allied bombing raids. The accuracy of their work often meant the difference between effective defense and catastrophic failure. Many auxiliaries worked in underground bunkers or hardened command posts designed to withstand bombardments, where they spent long hours monitoring instruments, updating charts, and handling urgent communications. In coastal regions and occupied territories, female auxiliaries supported naval operations by managing communication lines, decoding messages, organizing maritime logistics, and coordinating the movement of supply convoys. Their work was essential to the functioning of U-boat bases, coastal defense networks, and naval command headquarters. The Navy relied heavily on women for clerical and cipher duties, trusting them with sensitive intelligence that required precision and absolute confidentiality. Their integration into naval command structures demonstrated how indispensable female labor had become across every branch of the German armed forces, despite ideological attempts to minimize their visibility. While the Western Front was generally less chaotic than the East, female auxiliaries still faced danger from air raids, sabotage, resistance attacks, and the eventual Allied advance. During the final years of the war, particularly after the Normandy invasion, many women serving in coastal and communication units found themselves rapidly relocating as German forces retreated. They were often responsible for destroying sensitive documents, dismantling communication equipment, and ensuring that no intelligence fell into enemy hands. This added responsibility underscores the trust placed in their discretion and discipline. In both the East and West, female auxiliaries worked alongside male soldiers on a daily basis, creating complex social dynamics within military units. Although officially subordinate and framed as support personnel, their technical skills frequently placed them in positions of authority over specialized tasks. Their work required coordination with officers, technicians, and administrative staff, challenging the ideological narrative that women were incapable of professional competence in military settings. The reliance on female labor subtly undermined the rigid gender hierarchy that Nazi ideology sought to uphold, even as propaganda continued to emphasize traditional roles. Despite the essential nature of their contributions, female auxiliaries remained in an ambiguous legal and social position. They were not officially considered soldiers, were denied military ranks equivalent to men, and did not receive the same recognition or benefits. Yet their responsibilities, working conditions, and exposure to danger often mirrored those of military personnel. This contradiction reflected the broader tensions within Nazi society, where ideological commitments to gender norms clashed with the demands of modern warfare. By the final years of the war, female auxiliaries had become deeply embedded in the operational structure of the Wehrmacht across both fronts. Their roles had expanded from limited administrative tasks to include a wide array of technical, logistical, and intelligence responsibilities essential for sustaining military operations. Their presence in command centers, radar stations, communication hubs, and field headquarters demonstrated how the Wehrmacht, driven by necessity, relied on women to manage the increasingly complex demands of total war. The story of their service on both the Eastern and Western fronts not only reveals the extent of their contributions, but also exposes the contradictions, vulnerabilities, and human cost behind their involvement in a military system built on ideological rigidity and wartime pragmatism. Daily life, conditions, and social dynamics for German women serving in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service were shaped by a complex mixture of military discipline, ideological expectations, gendered hierarchy, and the constantly shifting environment of wartime Europe. Their experiences varied depending on their location, branch, and proximity to the front, yet common themes emerge across letters, diaries, military records, and post-war testimonies. These women lived in a world that blended the rigid structure of military life with the daily uncertainties and stresses of war. Although officially classified as auxiliaries rather than soldiers, their routines resembled those of military personnel in many practical aspects. They adhered to strict schedules, followed regulations governing conduct and uniform, and worked long hours that reflected the relentless demands placed on the Wehrmacht's communication and administrative systems. Their daily lives embodied a paradox. They were entrusted with responsibilities central to military. The moral ambiguity and ethical complexity surrounding the service of German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service represent one of the most challenging dimensions of their historical legacy. Their roles, while often described as non-combatant, place them in close proximity to the mechanisms of a genocidal regime and a war of annihilation. Yet the specific nature of their involvement varied widely, creating an intricate web of responsibility, complicity, coercion, and personal agency. Understanding this complexity requires examining the ideological framework in which they served, the institutional expectations imposed on them, the practical consequences of their duties, and the ways in which their presence supported, directly or indirectly, the broader machinery of the Nazi state. Unlike men in frontline roles, who were explicitly trained and expected to participate in acts of violence, female auxiliaries were positioned within the administrative, communicative, logistical, and surveillance infrastructures that made such violence possible. This structural proximity, rather than overt participation, forms the crux of the moral debate surrounding their wartime service. From the outset, the Third Reich positioned female auxiliaries within a contradictory ideological space. Nazi doctrine championed traditional gender roles, insisting that women's highest duty lay in motherhood, domesticity, and racial reproduction. Yet the war's demands necessitated their deployment into military-adjacent positions that contradicted these ideals. This ideological tension shaped the way women perceived their roles. Many were encouraged to believe that their service represented an extension of patriotic duty, rather than a deviation from prescribed social norms. Propaganda consistently portrayed female participation as uplifting, honorable, and essential to Germany's survival under siege. Thus, women often entered service with a sense of national loyalty and personal purpose, unaware, or in some cases unconcerned, about the deeper implications of their labor for the functioning of a totalitarian regime. This ideological framing does not absolve them of responsibility, but highlights how the Nazi state manipulated women's motivations in ways that blurred the line between voluntary service and ideological coercion. A central point of ethical examination lies in the degree to which female auxiliaries were complicit in the regime's criminal activities. Their operational roles were frequently embedded in systems that facilitated persecution, deportation, and mass killing, even if they themselves did not physically perpetrate violence. Women working in communication centers transmitted operational orders, logistical updates, and frontline reports, some of which pertained to anti-partisan operations, deportations, or actions against civilians. Those assigned to intelligence posts participated in document sorting, personnel tracking, and the processing of captured materials, thereby contributing to surveillance and repression. In anti-aircraft units, female auxiliaries coordinated targeting data that guided weaponry used in defensive actions, including in areas where civilian casualties were likely. In occupied territories, Administrative auxiliaries assisted in maintaining the bureaucratic order that governed forced labor systems and population controls. These roles illustrate how the machinery of genocide and occupation relied not only on frontline perpetrators, but on a vast array of support personnel, including women. Yet the specter of personal agency among these women was broad. Some joined enthusiastically, driven by ideological conviction, career aspirations, or a desire for adventure. For these individuals, participation in the Wehrmacht represented an opportunity to escape domestic limitations, gain status, or engage actively with the national cause. Others entered service under social pressure or economic necessity, viewing the auxiliary corps as a respectable alternative to factory work or conscripted labor. Still others were compelled through institutional pathways, such as the Reich Labor Service for Women, which channeled many young women into military support roles after completing mandatory labor duties. The question of voluntariness thus becomes complex. While the majority were not forced at gunpoint, many operated within a constrained socially political environment in which choice was heavily influenced by ideological, economic, and social pressures. Within this framework of constrained agency, the everyday moral decisions made by female auxiliaries varied significantly. Some actively embraced the regime's principles and sought positions that aligned them with centers of power or influence. Others expressed discomfort or moral unease, but rationalized their participation through a focus on professional tasks, personal advancement, or the belief that they were far removed from the regime's crimes. A smaller number attempted to distance themselves internally from the regime's ideology, seeing their service as temporary or unavoidable, rather than as a manifestation of loyalty. Rare cases exist of women who subtly resisted tasks they deemed unethical, refused assignments in certain units, or attempted to protect individuals in vulnerable positions. However, such acts were exceptions rather than the norm, and even in these cases, resistance was usually limited by fear of punishment, social ostracism, or institutional consequences. Institutional structures also played a significant role in shaping the moral landscape within which female auxiliaries operated. The Wehrmacht's hierarchical command system demanded obedience, discipline, and adherence to protocol. Women who questioned orders risked reprimand, reassignment, or dismissal, and their subordinate position in military hierarchy left little room for moral dissent. Moreover, the compartmentalization of duties meant that many auxiliaries lacked full awareness of the broader consequences of the information they managed or transmitted. This fragmentation of knowledge, common in totalitarian bureaucracies, enabled individuals to focus on narrow tasks while avoiding confrontation with the larger moral implications of their labor. Nevertheless, the inability to see the entire picture does not entirely absolve personal responsibility, since many women were aware of the regime's persecution of Jews and political opponents, even if they did not know the specific details of mass killings. Another dimension of moral ambiguity emerged from the relationships between female auxiliaries and male soldiers. The Wehrmacht leadership sought to regulate contact between men and women, fearing that fraternization might undermine discipline. Despite regulations, social interactions frequently occurred, ranging from everyday cooperation to friendships and romantic relationships. In some cases, women benefited from male protection or privilege within units, creating dynamics of favoritism or dependency. Conversely, the presence of women occasionally triggered resentment or accusations of impropriety, leading to social tensions within units. These dynamics complicate the evaluation of women's moral agency by introducing personal relationships, emotional ties, and power imbalances into their military environment. For some, relationships with officers resulted in special assignments or eased workloads. For others, unwanted attention created situations of vulnerability. The ethical implications of these interpersonal dynamics remain a significant area of historical inquiry, illustrating how gender played a central role in shaping the auxiliary experience. A further layer of ethical complexity lies in the actions of female auxiliaries during the occupation of foreign territories. Women stationed in Eastern Europe or behind frontline headquarters operated in regions where the Wehrmacht oversaw violent reprisals, mass executions, and forced relocations. While most auxiliaries did not directly participate in these operations, they lived and worked in spaces permeated by brutality. Their presence in occupied territories symbolized the normalizing impact of the German military machine on everyday life amid violence. For some women, this environment fostered desensitization. For others, it created moral shock. Diaries and later testimonies reveal a wide range of reactions, from indifference to discomfort, from ideological justification to private horror. What unites these accounts is the recognition that female auxiliaries, like male soldiers, existed in a system that demanded emotional adaptation to the harsh realities of occupation and war. As the war progressed and German defeat became increasingly apparent, the moral pressures intensified. Some female auxiliaries doubled down on ideological convictions, embracing a fanatical loyalty that mirrored the regime's descent into desperation. Others attempted to distance themselves, seeking transfers or adopting a stance of resignation. A number engaged in acts of self-preservation, destroying documents, denying knowledge of certain operations, or attempting to portray themselves as apolitical workers. These actions in turn became central in post-war evaluations of their conduct. As Allied authorities investigated the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 brought German women serving in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service into a period of profound upheaval, danger, and uncertainty, as the structures that had defined their roles dissolved and the consequences of their involvement in the Nazi war machine became unavoidable. In the final months of the war, the front lines were rapidly drawing closer to German territory, and the auxiliary units that once functioned within a vast and disciplined military apparatus now found themselves stranded, fragmented, or forced into chaotic retreats. Many female auxiliaries were stationed near command posts, communication centers, air defense networks, and administrative hubs that were evacuated under tremendous pressure, often in the face of advancing Allied forces. Their previously structured military routines deteriorated as the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of resource shortages, bombed infrastructure, and collapsing morale. The women, previously trained to embody order and precision, were thrust into desperate circumstances that tested their resilience, adaptability, and emotional endurance. For many, the collapse brought new fears: fear of Soviet retribution, fear of hunger and displacement, fear of being denounced or blamed for participation in a regime that was now universally condemned. The disintegration of chains of command left auxiliaries without shelter, instructions, or protection, forcing them to navigate a collapsing world with limited guidance and few choices. As Allied armies advanced into German-held territory, the fate of female auxiliaries diverged depending on where they were stationed. Those in Western regions often encountered American or British forces, whose occupation strategies, while strict, tended to emphasize documentation, demilitarization, and interrogation rather than immediate retribution. In contrast, women stationed in the East faced the advancing Soviet Red Army, which had suffered immense losses and trauma at the hands of German forces, and whose soldiers frequently viewed any individual associated with the Wehrmacht, male or female, as complicit in the destruction of their homeland. Many auxiliaries, aware of the dangers posed by the Eastern Front, attempted to flee toward the West, joining millions of other refugees on perilous routes marked by hunger, exposure, and chaos. Trains were overcrowded or destroyed, roads filled with retreating troops and civilians, and safe passage was never guaranteed. Some were captured en route, Others never made it out of combat zones. In this final phase of the war, the identity of female auxiliaries shifted dramatically, from disciplined support personnel to vulnerable individuals caught within the vortex of a collapsing empire. Upon capture by Allied forces, the treatment of female auxiliaries varied widely. American and British troops generally adhered to established procedures for dealing with prisoners associated with the Wehrmacht. Women were disarmed if they held any military-issued equipment, stripped of insignia or uniforms bearing the eagle and swastika, and subjected to questioning regarding their roles, assignments, and possible involvement in criminal activities. Most were classified not as combatants, but as military personnel in auxiliary roles, which typically resulted in temporary detention rather than long-term imprisonment. They were held in makeshift camps, repurposed barracks, or secured facilities where basic needs were met but freedoms were restricted. Interrogations aimed less at punishing the women individually and more at gathering information about Wehrmacht command structures, communications networks, and the final operational phases of the German military. Nevertheless, many auxiliaries felt deep anxiety, fearing that any association with the Wehrmacht might lead to harsh punishment regardless of their actual duties. The experience of auxiliaries captured by Soviet forces was markedly different. Soviet troops, driven by anger, trauma, and a desire for retribution, often treated captured German personnel, regardless of gender, with suspicion and hostility. Female auxiliaries were viewed as extensions of an army that had inflicted unimaginable destruction on the Soviet Union. Detentions often involved long marches, interrogation under harsh conditions, and confinement in temporary holding areas that quickly became overcrowded. Some women were sent to labor camps in the Soviet interior, where they endured months or years of forced labor, disease, and malnutrition. Others were released sooner but left deeply traumatized by their experiences. The disparity between the treatment by Western and Eastern allies underscores how geography shaped the post-war destinies of auxiliaries and how the final placement of a woman at the moment of Germany's surrender could determine whether she faced months of detainment or years of captivity. Beyond physical capture, female auxiliaries faced significant psychological turmoil as they confronted both the collapse of the ideological framework that once gave their service meaning and the uncertainty of how they would be judged in the post-war world. Many auxiliaries had genuinely believed that their work contributed to national defense or administrative efficiency, rather than facilitating the broader agenda of the Nazi state. For others, ideological conviction had been genuine, and the defeat of Germany triggered a profound crisis of identity. The dissonance between previous certainty and sudden condemnation created a psychological rupture that shaped post-war testimonies, self-perception, and personal narratives. Diaries and memoirs reveal a mixture of shame, defensiveness, denial, and attempts to rationalize wartime participation. Some women internalized guilt, feeling they had been part of a system that caused suffering, even if indirectly. Others insisted that they had merely done clerical or technical work and bore no responsibility for the crimes of the regime. The collapse forced every auxiliary to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity, obedience, and the boundaries of personal responsibility within a totalitarian system. Repatriation and reintegration into post-war society varied widely depending on the occupation zone and the individual woman's wartime role. In Western zones, many auxiliaries were released after providing statements about their service, though they sometimes faced denazification proceedings designed to categorize German citizens according to their level of involvement with the regime. Most were classified as followers or nominal participants, categories that carried lesser consequences than those assigned to individuals deemed active collaborators or perpetrators. These classifications often allowed women to resume civil life after several months of restricted rights or mandatory labor service. Some struggled to find work, as post-war German society, especially in the immediate aftermath of defeat, was suspicious of anyone who had worn a uniform. But over time, many reintegrated into the workforce, often returning to clerical or service positions they had held before the war. In Soviet-controlled zones, reintegration was more difficult. Many women returned from captivity weakened, traumatized, or stigmatized. The East German government initially promoted narratives emphasizing anti-fascist transformation, framing former auxiliaries either as victims of fascist manipulation or as workers who could be reintegrated into socialist society. Nevertheless, state security services often monitored them closely, particularly if they had served in communications, intelligence, or administrative capacities that the regime believed might have exposed them to sensitive wartime information. Some women struggled with the physical and psychological after-effects of captivity for years, compounded by the scarcity and hardship that defined early post-war life in the Soviet zone. The long-term consequences of auxiliary service for many women were deeply personal and often unspoken. Some suffered from trauma related to their wartime experiences or the brutality they had witnessed or endured during capture. Others faced social stigma, as communities sought to distance themselves from any association with the fallen regime. Marriage, employment, and even personal relationships were shaped by whether an individual was known to have served in the Wehrmacht. Some concealed their past entirely, fearing judgment or misunderstanding. Those who did speak about their service often framed it in terms of duty, necessity, or youthful naivety, rather than ideological conviction, reflecting both genuine sentiments and the powerful desire to avoid moral scrutiny. As the decades passed, the historical narrative surrounding female auxiliaries became increasingly complex, and many women found themselves navigating shifting societal attitudes and evolving scholarship. In the immediate post-war years, auxiliaries were often viewed through simplistic lenses, either as innocent clerks or as willing supporters of the Nazi system. With the emergence of feminist historiography and deeper investigations into the gendered dimensions of wartime participation, the experiences of these women gained new theoretical frameworks that acknowledged both their vulnerability within a patriarchal military structure and their potential complicity within an oppressive regime. This intellectual evolution forced many surviving auxiliaries to reassess their own memories, grappling once again with questions of responsibility, agency, and the ethics of survival. Ultimately, the collapse of the Third Reich and its aftermath marked a turning point that reshaped the lives of tens of thousands of women who had served in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service. Their fates, capture, interrogation, repatriation, or long-term imprisonment were shaped by geography, circumstance, and the biases. The memory, representation, and historical reassessment of German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service have undergone significant transformation over the decades, reflecting the shifting political, cultural, and scholarly landscapes that shape Germany's confrontation with its past. In the immediate post-war years, the experiences of these women were largely overshadowed by broader narratives of national guilt, victimhood, reconstruction, and the monumental task of accounting for the Holocaust and the crimes of the Nazi state. Female auxiliaries occupied an ambiguous place in these narratives. Neither celebrated nor heavily condemned, they were often portrayed as peripheral actors, functioning merely as clerical workers or technical assistants who lacked meaningful agency in the regime's operations. This early frame cast them primarily as victims of circumstance, young women swept up in a system they did not fully understand, performing tasks that seemed far removed from the violence of the front or the terror of extermination. This narrative was comforting to many former auxiliaries who sought reintegration into post-war society, but it also obscured the deeper complexities of their roles and the ethical implications of their service. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, West German public memory continued to rely on selective amnesia regarding broad participation in the Nazi system. The dominant cultural narrative emphasized reconstruction, economic recovery, and the reestablishment of democratic society. Discussions about women's roles in the Nazi era, including those who served in the Wehrmacht, remained superficial and often sentimentalized. Memoirs by former auxiliaries, when they appeared, focused on themes of discipline, camaraderie, and hardship during the final months of the war and captivity, while avoiding more controversial topics such as complicity or ideological conviction. In East Germany, official memory took a different path. The socialist regime framed female auxiliaries as victims of fascist indoctrination, using their stories as evidence of the corruption of capitalism and militarism. While this lens acknowledged that auxiliaries had participated in the Nazi system, it also absolved them of individual responsibility by presenting them as products of bourgeois manipulation rather than as autonomous agents. By the 1970s and 1980s, however, public memory began to shift. A new generation of scholars, activists, and filmmakers pushed for a deeper examination of ordinary Germans' involvement in the Nazi system. The emerging field of women's history challenged earlier assumptions that women played only minor or passive roles in the regime. Researchers began to analyze how women participated in and contributed to the functioning of a totalitarian state, not only as victims, but also as agents within a patriarchal structure that nonetheless offered them opportunities for authority, mobility, and influence. Within this framework, female auxiliaries came under renewed scrutiny. Studies highlighted how their administrative, logistical, and communications work played an essential role in maintaining the operational capacity of the Wehrmacht, a military force responsible for unprecedented destruction. The image of the harmless typist or innocent switchboard operator gave way to a more critical understanding of how bureaucratic labor enabled violence on a massive scale. The scholarly reassessment of the 1990s and early 2000s marked another turning point. Historians increasingly emphasized the concept of ordinary complicity, arguing that participation in the Nazi system took many forms, often without direct acts of violence. The publication of works examining the Wehrmacht's war crimes, including the groundbreaking exhibitions of the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, expanded public awareness of the Army's involvement in atrocities, shattering the myth of a clean Wehrmacht. Although these exhibitions focused primarily on male soldiers, they contributed to a broader reevaluation of the institutional structures in which auxiliaries worked. Female auxiliaries, once seen as peripheral, were now understood to be embedded within a military organization deeply complicit in crimes and genocide. Their roles in sorting intelligence, relaying orders, managing logistics, filing reports, or assisting in command posts were not neutral activities. They were components of a functional, destructive system. This historical reframing forced a reconsideration not only of what these women did, but how their labor supported the broader aims of a genocidal state. At the same time, cultural representations of female auxiliaries evolved in films, television dramas, novels, and documentaries. Early depictions often romanticized their service, portraying them as stoic young women facing the harsh realities of war. Later portrayals became more nuanced or critical, integrating themes of ideological indoctrination, moral entanglement, and personal responsibility. Popular media began to explore the lived experiences of these women in greater depth, their motivations for joining, their everyday routines, their interactions with soldiers, and their emotional responses to the collapse of the regime. This cultural shift reflected broader German efforts to confront troubling aspects of national history, moving beyond simplifications toward a more layered and honest engagement with the past. The evolution of memory was also shaped by generational change. As former auxiliaries aged, their testimonies became valuable historical sources, but also objects of scrutiny. oral history projects recorded their accounts, revealing a spectrum of experiences, from ideological enthusiasm to pragmatic participation, from regret to defiance. Many women maintained that they had no knowledge of war crimes, especially those working in offices far from the front. Yet their accounts often contained hints of selective memory, cognitive dissonance, or partial acknowledgement of the regime's brutality. Some admitted to hearing rumors or seeing frightening signs, columns of prisoners, classified reports, or conversations among officers, but insisted that they compartmentalized these observations. Others revealed deeper awareness, describing moments of moral conflict, discomfort, or fear. These testimonies, while invaluable, highlighted the challenge of reconstructing historical truth from human memory, shaped by trauma, pride, shame, and decades of post-war narratives. The question of responsibility remains central to contemporary reassessments. Historians emphasize that while female auxiliaries were often young, subordinate, and operating within a rigid authoritarian structure, they were nonetheless participants in a system dedicated to conquest and genocide. Their labor provided the Wehrmacht with the administrative and communicative efficiency necessary to wage total war. This understanding does not equate their roles with those of frontline perpetrators, but it challenges earlier portrayals that absolved them entirely. Contemporary scholarship avoids simplistic moral judgments, instead exploring how agency, coercion, ideology, gender, and institutional power intersected to shape their actions. This approach situates female auxiliaries within a broader framework of how ordinary individuals become entangled in systems of violence, an inquiry that extends beyond the specific context of Nazi Germany. In recent years, memorial culture in Germany has expanded to include more nuanced reflections on women's roles during the war, including both their suffering and their participation. Museums and educational programs now address gendered dimensions of the Nazi state, acknowledging that women were not merely victims of fascism, but also contributors to its functioning. Exhibitions explored the diversity of female experiences, from auxiliaries and factory workers to victims of persecution and resistors, highlighting the contradictions and complexities inherent in their stories. This holistic approach avoids the earlier tendency to categorize women into simplistic archetypes and instead embraces the multifaceted reality of their wartime lives. Internationally, representations of female auxiliaries have been shaped by varying cultural distances from the events of the war. In some countries, particularly those occupied by Germany, the presence of women within the occupation apparatus still carries emotional weight, complicating narratives of gendered innocence. Polish, Belarusian, and Ukrainian memories, for example, often include recollections of female auxiliaries working in command posts or administrative offices attached to units responsible for atrocities. These perspectives have received increasing attention in transnational historical studies, which examine how local memories intersect with global narratives of the war. Ultimately, the historical reassessment of German women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary service reveals the importance of examining not only what individuals did, but how societies remember, interpret, and evaluate those actions over time. Memory is not static. It evolves as new evidence emerges, as political cultures shift, and as younger generations seek to understand the past with clarity rather than comfort. The auxiliaries story, once marginalized, now occupies a meaningful place in discussions about gender, war, complicity, and the